In this third screencast, I'm going to introduce you to a graph that's pretty important, at least in terms of the AP exam, called the Phillips Curve. And what the Phillips Curve does is explore the relationship between unemployment and inflation. And we're going to see three generalizations, three things that we might glean from the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and we're going to see how the phone rings and how I have to get it. Excuse me one second. I'm glad they called because I had no idea that I did want to save 15% on my car insurance. Anyway, we're going to see three generalizations that we can glean from the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and we're going to see those generalizations graphed out in what's called the Phillips curve. So up to this point, we've seen that there is this trade-off kind of between unemployment and inflation. That unemployment and inflation are both things that policymakers are concerned with, and that we want low rates of both of them. So the question is whether that's actually compatible, whether we could actually have low rates of unemployment and low rates of inflation. So the three generalizations start with this first one, that in the short run, there is a trade-off between the rate of inflation and the rate of unemployment. And we can see that pretty clearly by looking at a short-run aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. Here's aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Again, we're just looking at that upward sloping portion of the aggregate supply curve. And let's say that aggregate demand increases from AD0 to AD1. Notice a couple of things. Employment goes up, which means that unemployment goes down, but price levels go up. So we get one good thing happening and one bad thing happening. The good thing is that unemployment's dropping, the bad thing, prices going up. And if we were to continue to push aggregate demand to the right, we would just see more of the same. Moving from AD1 to AD2, we would see that employment would go up even further, unemployment would go down, prices would go up. And again, moving from AD2 to AD3, simply more of the same thing. In the short run, there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. We can make one thing better, but we'd make the other thing worse if aggregate demand is moving. That's where the Phillips curve comes in. The Phillips curve is a graph that shows this relationship between inflation and unemployment. Now the axes of this graph look very similar to the axes of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. In fact, the y-axis is pretty much exactly the same. Before, on the ADAS graph, we called that price level. Here we're simply going to call it inflation, but realize that that's basically the same thing. On the x-axis, it looks the same, but it's slightly different. On the x-axis in the ADAS graph, we've called that employment. Here we have the same thing on the x-axis, but we're going to call it unemployment. And that's a big difference, because now moving to the right in this graph is a bad thing. Moving to the right in the ADAS graph is a good thing. That's more employment. Moving to the right in this graph is more unemployment. And that's really the only big difference between the axes of the two graphs. So what the short-run Phillips curve shows is this inverse relationship between inflation and employment. It was created by an economist called A.W. Phillips who explored this relationship historically. And what he saw was exactly what we would predict in the ADAS model. That when inflation goes down, unemployment goes up. When unemployment goes down, inflation goes up. Again, inverse relationship between these two variables. As inflation goes down, unemployment, and be careful of the un, goes up. We saw that back in the ADAS graph. Alright, so a couple of little things you should notice about the relationship between these two graphs. When aggregate demand shifts, we're moving along this thing we're calling the Phillips curve. If you look at the graph on the left, we have a certain level of prices and a certain level of employment and unemployment. If aggregate demand moves to the right, notice that price levels go up, inflation goes up, but also notice that employment goes up, or unemployment goes down. So moving from the equilibrium in the graph on the left, from the first AD curve to the second, or AD0 to AD1, we would move along the Phillips curve from point A to point B. In the graph on the left, we have higher inflation, but lower unemployment. That's exactly what we're showing in the graph on the right. Alright, so the first generalization, in the short run, we get this trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Second generalization, aggregate supply shocks, aggregate supply shifting to the left, can cause both higher rates of inflation and higher rates of unemployment. In other words, we get the worst of all worlds when aggregate supply shifts to the left. So again, going back to our side-by-side graphs, on the left we have the ADAS graph, on the right we have our short-run Phillips curve. Starting at a certain equilibrium point in the graph on the left, if aggregate supply shifts to the left, we get the worst of both worlds. When AS shifts left, we get both higher rates of unemployment and higher rates of inflation. We've given that a name before. We've called that stagflation. That's bad news. And when the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, we're not going to move along the Phillips curve anymore. We're now going to shift the entire Phillips curve. We get more of both bad things. In other words, the Phillips curve would shift out and to the right, and that's not where we want the Phillips curve to go. If you look closely on the graph on the right, what we'd like to be at, ideally in a perfect world, is at the origin, 0, 0, right? No inflation, no unemployment. So shifting out to the right, in the graph on the right, the Phillips curve graph, is the equivalent of aggregate supply shifting to the left in our aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. And it shows you that in the short run, we can have both bad things happening, stagflation. Okay, so in the short run, there's a trade-off between the two. Second generalization, sometimes both of them get worse, and we can again represent that by with our Phillips curve. The third generalization, and this is an implication of the whole long-run story that we've been telling, that in the long run, there is no significant trade-off between these two variables. To recognize that, let me bring you back to our long-run graph and the long-run stories. You'll remember that in the long run, even if we were to move away from this blue vertical line for even short periods of time, there was a story that brought us back to that blue vertical line. That's why we called that long-run aggregate supply. And if you focus closely on that blue line and think about the implication of it, what it means is that in the end, we're going to be at full employment. We're going to be at roughly 5% unemployment. Now you'll notice that any price level is associated with that. We can move up that blue line or down that blue line. In other words, inflation can be at any level in the long run, but in the long run we can only be at one level of GDP and one level of employment. What that means is that in the long run, the Phillips curve is also going to be a vertical line at the natural rate of unemployment, at full employment, which is roughly 5%. In the long run, we might have any rate of inflation, but we're going to be at full employment. So you need to be able to distinguish between the short-run Phillips curve, which shows that short-run trade-off between unemployment and inflation, and the long-run Phillips curve that shows that there actually is no trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And if you think that through even further, you could start thinking about some of the implications that economists think about. The implication is that if in the long run we're going back to full employment, we don't really need to worry about unemployment in the long run. And this is kind of like a shocking, well, maybe not shocking, that's a strong word, but this is a, kind of weird conclusion to make about this whole thing. This whole semester we've been worried about unemployment. The implication of the long-run aggregate supply curve is maybe that concern was misplaced. Maybe instead of worrying about unemployment, what we really should be worrying about is inflation. If we're going to be at full employment eventually, but we could be at any level of inflation, maybe that's what policymakers should really be focusing on. And there are economists that have said essentially this: don't worry about unemployment, worry about inflation. Now that was a relatively short screencast, but I don't want you to get from that that the Phillips curve is unimportant. It's very important for the AP exam. So for that reason, you'll find that on the online unit, I have a number of practice assignments relating to the Phillips curve that I link to, and I strongly urge you to check those out because you kind of have to know the Phillips curve down cold.
That's not fair that I failed the test. You said that I got question 1 wrong.
You did. The Bolshevik Revolution did not result in democracy in Russia.
But a friend told me that D would be the answer.
I am aware that you were trying to cheat. That is why I changed the answers before you took the test.
That's not fair.